variations. We're gonna just work in a short sleeve. I'm gonna show you some fast ways to do a sleeve alteration that can add some style or change up a little bit to a pattern that you already have. Statement sleeves are really big right now. So if you have a pattern that you love, but the sleeve's sort of boring, now you can change it up a little. If you haven't seen some of my past pattern making videos, I have one that I'll put up for you that is all the supplies you need, where to get. I'm working with some half scale slopers, so where you can print out and get your own little half scale slopers, or how to get full-size slopers that are your size. You can also work with the existing sleeve that's in the pattern that you want to alter, but you need to take into consideration the original design of the sleeve. So if the sleeve's already sort of full or super fitted, you just need to think about that. The sleeve we're going to work with is the basic fitted traditional sloper sleeve. So everything we're going to start with today is going to start from this. I'm going to tip the camera down and we're going to get going. I'm going to be using tape. I printed out some little slopers in color to make it easier for you to see what I'm doing, and I'm using pattern paper. I have colored pens, some paper scissors here, and then I've got lots of different curve forms and straight rulers and that sort of thing just for measurements. If you are at home and you don't want, and you're working on a full-size pattern, trace off. Don't cut into your original pattern. Trace it off. Use either tissue paper, like gift wrap tissue paper, or old wrapping paper, something like that, to trace off your pattern before you start, to keep the integrity of the pattern. If you do something you're not happy with, it's easy to just trace off another one. So we're going to start with a bell sleeve. And a bell is the sleeve that is fuller at the bottom than it is at the top. So the top's going to be fitted, but the bottom of the sleeve will be full. Now everything I'm going to be doing today is short sleeve. So I'm going to, this is the little elbow dart. So most of my patterns are going to be cut off right here at the elbow, and we're going to be working within this area. So the first thing I'm going to do before I do anything else is cut this off at the dart. So this pattern gives me a nice straight line to follow, so I'm going to use it. And it's important to keep track of our front, our back, and this is our shoulder. This is the center of the sleeve, but it's not the shoulder seam. So those are markings you want to make sure you keep track of. Another thing that you need to do if you're working in a pre-existing sleeve, not a sloper, is make sure that you have parallel and perpendicular lines on there to help you keep it straight. Because once we start cutting this apart, it would be real easy to get this off and your sleeve cap get really wonky. This is what our template's going to look like when we get started. For a bell sleeve, we're going to leave this part alone. The integrity of this is going to stay the same. So this is not going to change. We're going to change this down here. We want to make this fuller. So the easy way to do that is we're going to make a bunch of lines. So I've got some colored pens here. And I usually keep black for my final markings, so I'm not going to use black yet. I'm going to, normally I give myself a rule, like all the red ones are the cutting lines to start with, and changes are done in the other ones, and the final one is in black, something like that, just to help me keep it straight. So I'm going to use this pinky color. And you want to, in this case, make even slash lines, or even lines up and down. So I'm using this line here, which could be a grain line, on your pattern to help me. And the more lines you make, the more even you're going to be able to get the fullness to be. So I'm just going to draw some lines on my pattern. My ring is in the way, there we go. And these, I'm doing 1-inch lines. The more lines you have, the more play you're going to have. So if I do just these lines, I'm going to have 1, 2, 3 lines to open up. It's not going to change the underarm. It's going to change all of this in the middle. And the other thing I want to do before I start cutting is I'm going to tape down up here where I'm going to cut. I'm going to put a piece of tape to make my hinges nice and strong. So I'm going to tape wherever I've drawn a line. We're going to slash on those lines from the hem to the sleeve cap. You don't want to cut the other direction because we're not changing our sleeve cap. We're doing a bell sleeve. So this is the part that's going to get changed. This part we don't want to change. So I'm going to just slice up to but not through, so we have a little tiny paper hinge at the top. this is why we trace off. We don't use our original pattern. So now, see how that fans out? And look at how full we can get the bottom of that sleeve and make a bell sleeve very easily. And I only have 3 slash lines, but 4 pieces. Now, we just want to evenly space these apart and decide how full we want that sleeve at the bottom. And that's it. We tape it down. So this is going to be my base. And I'm going to take this, and what I usually do to keep everything straight so that I can make it nice and even, so I see I have these 3 pieces, is we'll tape down one spot and then I'll measure between those 2 and I'll make that same measurement so that they all come out measured the same distance apart from my little legs. So that when I see this one is, I'm going to do it in inches instead of centimeters because that's what I'm used to. Let's say if I did, for this little tiny sleeve, we do 1.5 inches, and then over here we'll do 1.5 inches, and over here we'll do 1.5 inches, and that's how wide my bell would be. Now if I want a really full sleeve, we're going more from bell into almost a butterfly sleeve, and once we've done that, I'm going to put a piece of tape just so it stays put. So this one is 2 inches apart. That sounds fine, because this is just a tester pattern. We're just going to tape down our little legs. If I didn't do this evenly, your sleeve is going to lay differently, so which may be something you want. You may want all the fullness in the middle and nothing anywhere else, and you'll arrange your little legs accordingly. But this is to give a nice even bell. You can see this slightly changed the shape up here, not a lot, but we're going to come in and true that up. And that's where something like this comes in handy, because you can use this just to make it a little smoother. You want to make sure though that the dimension stays the same, because if you change that dimension, it's not going to fit the same. The sleeve will not go in the same. So I'm just going to even these out. I'm going to use my little green one for this so you can see just how little I'm changing this. And the nice thing about these curves is you just move them around till you find the right spot. So can you see that tiny little bit of green? It's barely there. That's it. Now this is done. Now we're going to come down and true up this down here. Same way, make this pretty and even. And this should have a slight curve to it. You don't want to draw straight lines between there. That's not going to be as pretty. And now we have a finished sleeve. Now I'm working with a sloper. Slopers don't have seam allowance. So now it's time for me to come and add my seam allowance to make this a completed pattern. If you're working with a commercial existing pattern, it'll have seam allowance. So you'll just have to true everything up and you're ready to go. But I don't, so I'm going to get my little ruler here, and I'm just going to do, because this is a half scale pattern, I'm going to do 1/4 inch seam allowances. Maybe 1/2 inch, and this is 1/4 scale after all. When you're done, make sure that you label it. So you want to say, this is my bell sleeve for this pattern, the size that it is. We forgot to go back in and put a grain line, because we cut on that grain line. So we can still keep this grain line if we want, but you can see how it's not in the middle anymore. It was right down the center of the sleeve, so I'm probably going to redraw my grain line for this one. So there is my little bell sleeve. The next one we're going to do is the lantern, and it's exactly this sleeve. So a lantern is this sleeve with a cuff. So let's go ahead and make an actual cuff real quick. I'm going to just do it on this right over here. We're going to say that this little bicep, actually we'll measure this one right here. We're going to say that this little bicep was about 5 inches. So I'm going to just draw my 5-inch rectangle. So there's my 5-inch rectangle, and I want this to be a finished 1/2 inch cuff, because this is half scale. So I'm going to make a 1-inch cuff so I can fold it in half. So there's my little cuff, and I'm going to put my little markings. This is my fold line down the middle. Now I'm freehanding this, but if you're doing this, make sure you measure it. make it nice and even. So there's my fold line, and I would write that. And now I'm ready to come in and do seam allowance around it. Now this is a straight fitted cuff. I could do a casing and gather this too, and that would also give you a lantern sleeve that would just be gathered. All right, and there's our little cuff. Okay, so we've done a bell and a lantern because it has the cuff, or you could do an elastic. You get both with this one cutting. Now we're going to do a gathered in the cap, so a puff sleeve. We're going to start again with our plain little sloper. We're going to make it short sleeve because we're going to have a little short gather. Now the gather, the puff sleeve, is the same here, and all the fullness is going to be up here. So now we're changing our sleeve cap. This is where it gets very interesting. So we're going to again draw our lines, and the more lines, the more ways you can, more places you can change your fullness. So I'm going to draw my cutting lines for this. You don't want to change between these two notches. So from notch down here, we don't touch. This is a no touch. Don't touch that little part. We're not going to do any changes in there. Once you start changing that, you change the way the sleeve fits and goes in, and it's the one area that is a no-no. We just do not bother that. And even in a gathered sleeve, you usually don't have gathers under your arm. This is the armpit. We don't have gathers there as a rule. So here's my two little lines. Now I could have another line. There's plenty of room, depending on how full I want this. But it's there. Okay. So now, last time we had our hinges at the top, now we're going to have our hinges at the bottom. So I'm going to tape down here just to keep our hinge integrity. All right, and again, we're cutting to, but not through. So I'm going to cut. Okay. So now you can see how easily we can get this to open up for a full sleeve. Now when we do this, we're going to have to really pay attention and redraw these lines to get a nice shape in the sleeve cap, because we've changed it a lot. But right here at the elbow, it stayed the same. Now, you could do this sleeve but want it shorter. You could, before I did all of this, I could have said, you know, I want a puff sleeve, but I want it a little tiny short sleeve. Cut it off at the length you want it first, and then do this. It makes your life a lot easier than trying to shorten it after you've done this alteration. So we're going to now start taping down, and I'm going to tape this little piece right here down, make it stay put, and then I'm going to make markings so I know how far apart I want to make these spaces to make it nice and full. Because of how we're gathering, we may want more fullness here and less here. It's all in the shaping that you want for that puff sleeve. So here in the very center of my sleeve, I'm going to make a little marking at 1.5 inches, and then I'm going to push this over to the 1.5 inches and tape it down. Make sure everything's nice and flat. Okay, and now I'm going to do the same thing here. And you can see how full this gets. You know, see how big this is getting in this tiny little sleeve. If this were a full-size sleeve and you were doing this, I'm doing 1.5, you were doing 3 inches in each of these. 3, 6, 9, if you continued, 12, 15. You could have added 15 inches to this sleeve up here. Okay, now we're going to redraw this sleeve cap using one of our curves. So this does not change, we know that, and we know that it's going to come to this point up here. So in between, we've got to get a nice smooth shape. And you can add a little height here if you want to, but you don't have to. It will change the shape, the look of your, I'm going to switch to green, greeny blue. Okay, we're going to go like this right here, just to get the shape pretty and right. So you can see how that's added some fullness. Whoops, it's added fullness and it's added height here. So you can see that's how that's changed. If you've ever done a puff sleeve, This is probably going to look kind of familiar to you. So this is sort of how they look. What I'm doing is I'm going from high point to high point to high point like that. I'm skipping my low points. I'm ignoring those to get the shape right. And there is a very, very, very full puff sleeve. Now I would put on here, put my little markings, get dots like this, and then write the word gather, right? So we know why it looks like this. I write gather here. I need to redraw my grain line, which was right down the center. So if this was 1.5 inches here, that's a 3/4. That's half of that. And we're going to divide it right down. Here's my new grain line. Okay. And this is gather. All of this right here. So I'd write that on there, and now I do seam allowance, and we're done. And we have to choose, you know, what we want for the hem of this sleeve, how we want to finish it, if we want a deeper one. If we're hemming a sleeve, it's usually deeper than your seam allowance around. We add that on. We have now a puff sleeve, a gathered puff sleeve that's fitted at the elbow, right above the elbow. If you do a leg of mutton sleeve, have you heard of a leg of mutton? This is what a leg of mutton is, but it's full length. It's the long sleeve. So this is the same as a leg of mutton. This is a short sleeve leg of mutton. We're gonna now go to the true puff sleeve, which is, we're gonna cut it apart. So this is where it's really important for us to pay attention to our lines here, because we don't want anything to happen. So we're going to do a short sleeved true puff sleeve. So it's going to gather at the top and the bottom. Some great big old sleeve. Think 1980s. So this time we're going to draw the same lines we did before. However, we're cutting through. We're not going to hinge it. So you have to make sure that you've got a good horizontal line for lining everything up. And usually a pattern will have one somewhere on there. If they don't, make sure you do it. And make sure it's perpendicular to this lengthwise grain. So if you're drawing it yourself at home, and you've got a grain line, go right across that grain line. Line up your grain line with this nice nifty ruler with all the little lines to make it perfectly straight, and draw a line across so that you'll have that for lining up when we're ready to tape everything back together. So I'm not going to have to tape for hinges this time. We're just going to draw our lines on. And you could do, like I've been doing 1-inch lines. It's up to you how you want to do it and where you want it. So I'm going to do a puff sleeve, and I'm going to keep it really inside the cap here. And I'm going to do a little bit shorter line. Let's see. Yeah. I'm going to do more lines, but they're going to be closer together. So we're going to do 1/2 inch apart. All right. So there's our lines. I'm going to get a fresh piece of pattern paper here, and I'm going to cut apart on these lines. A lot of times if you have a whole lot of lines like this, you number them, just so you keep them in order, so you know which one's which. So I'm going to do that really quick. On this one, it's pretty easy to tell which order they go on, but if you're working with a different sleeve that has a sleeve cap that's not as obvious, it would be good to order it to make sure you don't end up getting something out of whack. We're going to cut these apart. So now that I've got all my little numbered pieces here, something I should have done before I did all that was draw my nice line on here. That's going to be what I use to keep it all straight. So I'm going to draw a line across, and make sure you have enough room top and bottom for your pattern pieces. See, I'm going to use that line now to line everything up. But I want to decide how full I want my sleeve. So even before I do that, I'm going to come in and make markings on this line. And that's going to be how far apart my little pieces are. So I'm going to do a little cross here. So here's the center of my sleeve now. And then I'm going to start lining up my pieces every 1/2 inch. So I'm just going to go 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch, and make little markings for myself. All right, so there's all these pattern pieces, and 2 somehow got all the way over there. So here's my little matchsticks. And now we're going to just start lining them up. So here we go, 4 and 5. See how I have my little marking to help me? And and we're going to line them up right. I'm using this black line, but it could be this blue one, as long as we keep them all the same. If we did not have that parallel line, can you see how easy it would be to get this off a little bit and not know for sure exactly where we were? So now we're going to start taping down. You can see how full we've made that sleeve. Now I always come in and put extra tape down because there's so many little pieces and they catch on each other, and they catch on my rulers when I'm trying to do my seam allowance. If I were making this full scale pattern and planning on, if I were designing something, I would, after I did all this work, I usually lay down another piece of tissue and retrace the whole finished thing, so I don't have all these little pieces on there to work with. I just think it's a lot easier to have a complete pattern, complete smooth pattern without any little, all these little pieces that can lift up and catch and stuff. Now I'm ready to true my cap. This is going to be easy because this isn't shaped at the bottom, so we can just come right in and true this up down here. And there we are. There's our hit. That's the easy part. Now up here for the sleeve cap, we're going to kind of do the same thing, hitting the high points. So I'm going from this high point to this high point, and move the ruler according to where you think you need it to get you the shape. You don't want your sleeve cap to be scalloped like this when you're done. You don't want those little scallops. It should be nice and smooth. All right, so now we're ready to draw a grain line, say gather from here to here. The gather lines, it's really easy to tell where our first cut is where the gather starts. So now that's my gather, and the same down here, gather. Now it may be where you gather the top and you put a casing in the bottom for elastic. There's lots of choices you can make, or make your little cuff for the bottom of this. It's a design detail. It's up to you how you want it, but this will then be a very full puff sleeve when we're through. So all I need to do now is add seam allowance. Now I'll just tell you real quick, I don't love how this is sort of flat right here. It's just me personally. When it's gathered, it would not be noticeable at all, but I would tend to almost increase the sleeve cap just a tiny bit, just to give this a nice smoothness, nice and smooth. And also, a lot of times the puff sleeve has a high sleeve cap. They'll put either a shoulder pad, or you'll see where they put the little netting and all this stuff on the inside to make it nice and full and stand out. So if you're doing this puff sleeve, you may want a higher sleeve cap for that. And if you do, it's done with this. You'll take this and you'll kind of take this shape and you'll come up however high you want for that sleeve cap. But you want to keep it wide. You want a high and wide for gathers, like this one. See how wide it is? It's high and wide. High and wide for that sleeve cap gathers. If it's high and narrow, what ends up happening is you get a pointed shoulder. It'll look pokey at the top of the shoulder. It's just not going to look quite right. Unless you're going for the pokey look. Like, let's face it, when you're designing, you never know. Somebody may want that look. All right, grain on it for my grain line, and gather for these little areas and any other markings that you need to do. On this one, for instance, I would write on here 1/2 inch hem, so I know that this was deeper for a hem. On this one, I haven't done my seam allowance, so I'll have to come back and do that. And this one, I didn't put a grain line on. I better do that really quickly. Let's add its grain line. And to do that, we're going to go from this point up here at the shoulder, because originally the grain line went down the center of the sleeve, so we're going to keep that for now. That can change, but in this case it's not going to, so now I'm going to measure the difference here, which is... Alright, and now we're ready to go. So here are my little pieces completed, and this is actually 4 patterns, because this one could either be a bell or a trumpet, depending. This is my full puff, my full gathered sleeve, my true puff sleeve. This one is a leg of mutton. It's gathered only in the cap. With a sleeve like this that has such a shaped hem at the bottom, it's hard to turn that up and hem it, and I would tend to make a facing for that. And to do a facings are nice and easy. You just trace over it. So we take what we've got. I'm going to find a pencil here, and we trace and we decide how deep we want our facing to be for this little sleeve. And that's it. And we mark it, we say what it is, we name it. And because I've already added my seam allowance, I can copy that for the bottom of this sleeve. And I'll just have to add it to the top. And we're ready to go. So I'm going to go make all these little sleeves up and I'll show you how they look. So here's our first little sleeve. This is the bell. You can see the shape. Here it is from the front. And that's this pattern. There's a little trumpet sleeve, exact same pattern. I gathered it and put it on a little cuff. That's all there is. So there's no gathers in the top. It's a fitted sleeve. I just don't have a bodice, so it's a little hard to see, but that's what that is. Isn't that cute? Look at that cute little sleeve. So here's the leg of mutton sleeve. It's this one where this line didn't change. It was all in the sleeve cap. This is a very attractive sleeve, and I really like this in the long sleeve too. I think it's a really cute, very old-fashioned belle epoque style. So there's your pretty little leg of mutton. And this is the one where I would recommend doing a facing hem if you do a short one like this. From the front, sort of looks like that. You can see all those, it's got a lot of gathers in it. Here's the true puff sleeve. This is its pattern. It's gathered at the top and at the bottom. It is not gathered in this area on either piece, so it's not gathered under the arm. And that's how it looks from the side. That's how it looks. It's not hemmed, so you can kind of see, but that's our cute little puff sleeve. See you next week.